Welcome to the Why God Why podcast. My name is Peter Englert. I am here with our illustrious producer, Dan Austin, and then our experienced, where do you want to go with that? Fantastic.
Does that mean old?
No.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm experienced.
Okay.
Does that make me old?
Well, a little.
A little.
Okay.
To our listeners, probably.
Yeah.
Our co-host, John and Maya. We are here today with Shelby Keys. We flew her in all the way from the great city of Boston, Massachusetts. Go Yankees. And today,
Go Bills.
There you go. Today, the question is, why does God want us to be curious? So that was a question she picked. I was going to title this episode, Why Does Shelby Have So Many Questions? So she's an actual listener. She's probably like, when we think about the questions we ask, we try to think about the questions Shelby actually asked. So this is going to be a little different. We're going to have some fun with it. John, do you have any thoughts before we get started?
I'm excited to have Shelby here. We had a great convo ahead of time. As you and I were coming up with this podcast idea way back in the day, I don't know how many years ago was that now?
2019, yeah.
2019. We were kind of saying to ourselves, it was a meeting in Starbucks, and we were like, how about if we were provided a space where people could just ask questions, and we were doing our best to engage in these questions that people really have about life and about faith, and what would that be like? And so I feel like, in a sense, what we're doing here today is kind of returning right back to those roots in a really healthy way. And this is exciting for me. This is what I love doing, just having conversations with people. So
Shelby, before I throw it to you, this is like full disclosure.
Yeah.
So when guests come on our podcast, I go, hey, so think about this. There's a guy named Greg Keys who's in his 20s and he has questions about life. And then sometimes I go, there's a woman named Shelby Keys. That's who you're talking to. So you are like our target audience. I just want to throw that out there.
I love it. Thank you. Thanks for having me on here.
Well, there we go. Hey, why don't you tell us about your story? Give us a little background, what you're up to, and we'll dive right in.
Yeah, no, sounds good. So, grew up here in the area, back in my hometown, getting back to my roots, and grew up in the church, and, in college kind of stepped away, from the church. As somebody who, had parents involved in the church, I wanted to kind of find my own path and rediscover God for myself and what that meant. It was one of those things where you never asked maybe a lot of questions out loud when you're in the church, or never took time to really dive deep and explore the faith for yourself. And so in college that was really a time of exploration for me. And when I graduated, I ended up moving. There was a lot of change, ended up, kind of staying connected to the church community, but not really, would show up to church maybe once a month. But I had moved to Boston, and Boston was a city where, believe it or not, there weren't a lot of churches or easy access to churches. So I took some time off, from God, so to speak, and lately have started to dive back into the faith and the church and what that means to me. So I appreciate you guys having me on here. It's awesome to have the opportunity to ask questions that maybe I've never really gotten the chance to ask as I reconnect with God.
I want to back up before we go into more of your story, because I think I don't hear this from you, but like in high school, you said I wasn't asking questions. And so a lot of times church leaders, they think we just need to inundate Shelby in high school with information. But I guess I didn't hear that you were angry with faith. I didn't hear that you were upset with faith. It almost sounds more neutral. What was happening in high school spiritually as you look back at it now?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of internal turmoil, to be honest, but it's kind of like I was a blind follower, right? Your parents said, go to church, do X, Y, Z. You were scared that if you stepped away, that you no longer had access to God and his kingdom. And so it was kind of like, all right, do the thing, follow, everything will be okay. And you're like, yeah, sure. Okay. I'm going to go along and do all these things. But, as you become older and you become an adult and you have more of that freedom, you realize, hey, it's okay to ask questions, and I have the choice now to do what I want to do, right? I don't have to go to church on Sunday if I don't want to, because mom and dad say, we're all going to church as a family. It's the thing to do. And yeah, I don't think I was ready. I don't place it on my leaders as any fault to them. I just don't think I was ready to really reflect and ask the questions that I needed to. What does this mean for me? Why, as we're on this podcast, why God, why, why does God say certain things, or why am I doing this? And I really started to question the older that I got.
Well, before we jump into more, I think that's great. Why don't you just kind of fill us in where you are spiritually? And then I think that's a great segue for John and I to have a lot of fun. Sound good?
Yeah, this is great. I'm just having a great time. Yeah, go for it.
No, it's a great question. I think spiritually right now, I believe in God. I believe in his son, Jesus. I believe that Jesus died on the cross. I've read the Bible, I believe the message, but I have a lot of questions, as I explore my own faith. It's like, okay, I believe in God, but why have a relationship with God? Why put in the effort to have a relationship with God? Why go to church, right? Why do the things that I did all throughout high school? So I'm at this crossroads between just believing and then taking it a step further and really investing, right? There's a difference between just kind of, checking the box, and now actually, taking that relationship further and having a meaningful relationship with God. I will say there were times where I was hurt by the church too. And I'm now realizing that, the church is filled with imperfect humans. That was something I never realized. I was like, we're all Christians. We're sinners. I understood that in high school, but I was like, we should try our best to be, great. And God forbid, we saw anyone in the church do let's say a wrongful act, right? Or sin. It was like, oh my gosh, the end of the world for me as a high schooler. And I'm like, no, the church is full of imperfect people. I've realized that, as is the world. And we have to, give people grace and compassion. So.
That's so cool. I love your story, Shelby. And I love how you're just honest with who you are and where you're coming from. As I hear you talk, one of the questions that comes to my mind is, why go back? Like what internally was happening that you said, man, I really want to go back again. I want to check this out. I want to experiment again. What was happening inside that brought you to that point?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think this is my first time reflecting on that. It's funny because my husband and we bought a place in Maine, and this was in the thick of my bodybuilding. We're at a Planet Fitness across the way from this church in Maine. And my husband looks over and he's like, hey, we should go and check out that church when we're done here. Just out of the blue. And I'm like, sure. Okay. You'd have to ask him, why he wanted to do that. And so we go over there, we meet a woman, and everyone was super welcoming, almost over the top. So I'm like, I'm just looking to kind of sneak in, get some information. And next thing you know, you're connected with 10 people, at the church, which is great. Maybe a little overwhelming for, first timers, but I'm like, well, this is the Christian way, super welcoming. I've been to churches like this before, and they were like, yeah, we're a non-denominational Christian church. She's like, I actually go to the CrossFit gym next to Planet Fitness, and my husband and I have been CrossFitters for 10 years. So she's like, come to CrossFit and then we can go to church together. And so we got connected, to this church. And, again, there was nothing really pressing. I don't have this, crazy story of like, oh, I hit rock bottom or anything like that. It was just like, I know when I go to church, I feel better internally. I feel like I have a better moral compass. I'm more patient. I'm more kind. I have less anger, all these things that, that make you feel like a good human being, so to speak. But you also just, I feel like, can't put in to words. And I'm like, I don't think this is just the placebo effect. Something's going on here. So yeah, I think it was just kind of, we were looking to get a little bit of that moral compass back. And we knew what it felt like when we had been connected to God.
Yeah.
So we actually have like a studio audience here. So Adam, your husband's here.
Yep.
When Adam said, let's go back to church, and you've identified you've been hurt by the church, what was it about this year at Planet Fitness in Portland that you said, sure, why not?
Great question. Great question, Peter. I am one that believes in multiple chances. And it had been a while since we'd been connected. And so I think this time, like I said, I was like, I knew how I felt, when I was going to church. And that's God, right? Like that's God. Like yes, I've been hurt by the church, but I was hurt by people within the church. Mm-hmm. And I could have asked like, why God, why did you do this? But again, I'm a believer in forgiveness and chances. And I think I knew deep down that it wasn't God's fault that I was hurt. It was an imperfect human, that's why I was hurt, that, maybe sinned or didn't meet my expectations, whatever it was. So I said, sure, let's check it out. And it's been a wonderful experience so far. And we're just getting reconnected. This is this all happened and transpired like 2 months ago.
That's amazing. That's so cool. Like the freshness of it. Like I'm sitting across a table from you, watching you, and I love the freshness that's in your voice. And I think the word that keeps coming to my mind as I hear you talk is there's some sort of hope that's in you. It seems like you're hopeful.
Yeah.
Like
said.
That,
yep.
Is that describe what's happening underneath the surface a little bit? Like you feel more hope?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think definitely well said. You hit the nail on the head. Very, very hopeful.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Well, John and I tend to be more feelers. You're kind of like, hey, let's go. So as I hit my phone on here. So without further ado, we're going to let you kind of run, where do you want to go next? You got some spiritual questions, and we're just we might push back on you. You're definitely going to push back on us. So let's have some fun.
Yes. No, this is awesome. Again, I appreciate your taking time to answer my questions. Now that I have them and I have a safe space to ask them. You
and a couple thousand listeners.
Yes.
No big deal.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's important to dive into these questions because a lot of us do have these questions that maybe they don't have a clear answer, or we feel silly for asking them. And I will be totally transparent that even though, I grew up in the church, it's been a little bit since I've dove into the Bible. And so I certainly don't know it, like as well, like the back of my hand, or as well as you guys probably do. So it's helpful to dive into the material that, these verses that we're taught as kids that so easily, escape us. So I'm excited. So I guess, question number one.
Yeah.
Starting way back at the beginning, I'm curious. I've always wondered, why did God create Adam? Why did he start creation in general here on earth when he could have, if he was, bored or lonely? I don't know. Does God get bored or lonely? When he could have just created, man up in heaven, with him, or started a kingdom up in heaven. Why go through all this trouble to create mankind and then sin and then send his son? It seems like a very complex stepwise process that could have been simplified.
Go ahead, man.
Well, first of all, there's been like volumes of books written about that. So I will do my darndest, but Peter can jump in there too. Bottom line is there's a mystery to this. You and I were talking about this ahead of time. Like there's some things that we can speak fairly intelligently about, but underneath it all, there's going to be some mystery that we hold in tension. Like, why did God do this? I don't know. So I can give you the catechism church answer. He did it for his glory. Okay, that sounds kind of, very churchy.
Right. And what does
But
that even mean?
Yeah, right.
Yep.
Yeah. Like, what is, like, as a kid, I heard these things and I'm like, what does that mean? Like, for his glory, like that kind of a thing. But I think what it gets to the bottom of, so God, this shows us something about God. What you're describing in even your own experience of pulling away and then coming back again, it's this sense of God wants that for us. He wants his creation to be able to interact with him in a way that isn't just like a bunch of robots, but like this is their choice. And I want them to have a choice between doing their own thing or following me. And there's something intrinsic in that he wants us to have. And I think that's love, right? Because you can't truly love somebody, or somebody can't truly express their love for you if they don't have a choice.
Right.
And so God, in the mystery of all of this, for some reason, he set it up so that humanity had a choice, so that, there's this choice in the spiritual realm as well, and that our choice is, do we want to follow him? Do we want to be there with him? Just like a marriage would be, like, do I want to make this commitment to this person? Forever's a long time, and so this choice, this driven by love, and I think if I could distill it down into one word, that's how I would describe it, is love. Like, God loves us so much that he wanted to create humanity, and then for humanity have a choice to follow him or not to follow him.
So when I got your first, so listeners, Shelby sent me an Instagram message with 20 questions. And so I was reading them all, and your first question is definitely, I think, a theme for most of your other questions.
Yep.
So I let John answer so that I can ask you this question. It seems like one of your biggest struggles with Christianity is this idea of free will. And I think one of your Instagram messages to me, you're like, if God knows what's right, and this is so you, if God knows what's right, why doesn't he just, just tell everybody, do what's right? Just go do it. I was about to say, slap you across the head, just go do it, So I guess I'm trying to get behind this, question about free will and why that's so important to you.
Yeah. And I hear both of you, when you say, okay, God wants us to choose him, hearing it out loud, I'm like, okay, that makes sense as to why God doesn't just, slap us across the face, so to speak, and say, go and do that, right? He wants us to have a choice. And I guess the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around is, and again, maybe it goes back to choosing him as to why he gives us, free will. But my biggest question is there really free will to begin with in general, right? I'm all for God giving us a choice. That's great. Cause you're right. I'm very independent and I want to make my own choices, but how much of a choice do I actually have if God already knows what's going to happen, or who I'm going to end up with, or if I'm going to end up choosing him. And I might be wrong, right? That's why I'm here. Correct me if I'm wrong, because, what I was taught growing up, or how I at least interpreted it, was that God knows all, right? He knows what's going to happen, before X, Y, Z. So I'm like, okay, so God knows probably that I'm going to go back to him potentially, at what stage in my journey, I don't know. I don't know where this, newfound, kind of rediscovery of God and this relationship is going to go. But he does. So it's like, did I really have a choice if he already knows what's going to happen?
Yeah.
That's a lot to think about. I'm going to go a little nerdy on you. So
go for it.
So for some reason, I'm hugely fascinated with IBM right now. So I grew up 2 blocks from where IBM started. And for listeners that don't know, you could probably fast forward through this part. But basically IBM, a lot like Kodak, made all these inventions. You study the history, they actually made Windows before Windows came out. They were the pioneers of computers, but they actually held all these inventions back. And I mean, our Rochester friends will know this. Like Kodak actually designed the digital camera,
Yep.
or something like that, before like anybody else did, like before the iPhone and stuff. But they sat on it, and so I think God kind of had a choice in creating people. He could have sat on it. Like he could have said, like, hey, I'll just kind of hold on to all of this. But, I think the truly great inventions, not that we're operating systems, computers, or cameras, but there's a level of, I'm going to invent this, but I'm actually going to give this to people. And it hopefully will go in the right direction, but sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes not going in the right direction, there's things that computers are used for, obviously, right now that aren't good, but the world's a very different place. And I guess as I've been thinking about that question, I've been just kind of, we see this all the time. So God calls us and he says we're created in his image. So anytime that you create something, I'll go directly to you for a second. So you're a health coach.
Yep.
Well, is that the right term?
Registered dietitian.
Registered dietitian.
Yes.
We want to make sure we get that on there. So you're a registered dietitian. So what you want to do with your clients is it's not just about eating right and exercising right. It's living with this mindset of making healthy choices, feeling good about yourself. Now, there's actually some people that you hand them the plan, and this might be the rare exception, where they overdo it, where they don't eat as much as they should, or they exercise too much. And what you're trying to do is set that person in the right direction, but even too much of a good thing in their free will, and as strong of a leader as you are, you're entrusting them to live out almost in a small way, the way God intended them to live. I don't know. Push back on me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So my question then is, I guess the difference is I don't know the choice that they're going to make ahead of time, whereas it seems like God does. And maybe it's one of those things where he's kind of sitting back and he's like, yes, I know what they're going to do before they do it, but it might not be what I, maybe had intended for them or chose for them. But that's where it gets confusing, right? Because it's like, if God already knows the choice that we're going to make, is it really our choice? Or it is maybe, and he's just not intervening, but it almost seems like, well, can that choice change? And then, are there 20 choices that, somebody might choose? And he just knows that these are the 20 choices, available. Just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
What's the big deal about God knowing all and not you can push back, even assume this, him sometimes intervening, sometimes not. What's the big deal about that? What's really behind all of that?
Because then it feels like it's not free will or it's not my choice. It seems like God has a hand in that choice, which I want complete control of that choice.
So let me have some fun with you. So as a registered dietitian,
Yep.
you might not know fully that someone's going to make a choice.
Right.
But I'm sure that there's indicators that you're like, this person's on the right path. And there's other indicators that they're not on the right path.
Sure. Yep. But they have a choice at the end of the day. Because you're right. I give them the blueprint and then they're like, okay, at the end of the day, if they want to go off track, they have complete freedom to do so. And I don't know until we check in again, right? I have no idea how things are going to play out, but God does.
But when you sense someone getting off track, do you intervene or do you wait? Or how do you make that choice?
Sometimes I don't know, right? They could be right on track when they meet with me and then come, let's say I met with somebody yesterday, right? So yesterday's Friday, they meet with me, everything's going great. And then today, world falls apart for them. Something happens and they go completely off track. I had no indication, right? Maybe they had no indication. It's obviously, a little bit more complicated, but if we use the example of, let's say emotional eating, if somebody, has a, tumultuous event that occurs, or like I said, their world turns upside down and it leads them to emotionally eat. Maybe they couldn't predict that. They were on track yesterday, something stirred up something today, and now they're off track, but I don't meet with them again until Wednesday. So I don't know.
But I think what you described is a lot of the way that God works in us.
How so?
So if I'm on the wrong track, there's a continuum of, and we see this all throughout the Bible. I can give you stories in my life. There's sometimes that God shuts a door, I'm on the wrong track, shut it.
Yeah.
There's other times when I'm on the wrong track and God kind of lets me go there. And it's okay, this is what you want to do. This is what you wanted. Sometimes there's a neutral space where God actually gives us choice and it could work out. And I think the best way to describe a neutral state, my daughter Haley, I said to her, the goal was she needs to get out of the car with her bag for school and not leave the parking lot. So what she did was she grabbed her bag from the front seat, got out of the car, stepped down. She got to where she wanted. It wasn't necessarily the order, but, am I going to micromanage that? And then the second one is you're going down a good path. Sometimes God intervenes more. Sometimes he intervenes less. I don't know. John, do you want to add any thoughts? Or
Wow. There's a lot here. There's a lot. It's such good stuff, too. I mean, this is like 50 podcasts in one conversation. So,
leave it to Shelby Keys to do that.
No, it's so good. I'm just trying to figure, okay, where do I enter into this space? Because this is really, really rich. And I think you're bringing up something. When you said something about control, it seemed like there was some kind of almost emotion behind when you said that. Am I right?
Yeah, well, 100%, because it's as I even listened to Peter describing this.
Right.
On one hand, you're like, okay, thanks God, for intervening when I'm going down a bad path and shutting a door,
Right.
But that's limiting my choice, right? I now don't have that choice because you closed that off to me. And I guess, even that's a little bit different than, how much does he intervene? So he's intervening that way, in our choice, but does he control, our thought process choice? And maybe not, maybe I'm just controlling the surroundings and environment. And so I'm like, okay, but again, that's limiting me in some way, shape, or form. I'm being limited or intervene. My life, you are intervening on my life.
Yeah. I think I understand where you're coming from on that. Yeah. If I could maybe just ask a question with it, is there anything about that gives you comfort, though, if you think about that?
Yeah, I think in some way, totally, right? To know that there's somebody potentially, watching out for me, it sounds like, definitely. It's that there's that constant battle of, comfort and then going back to, complete independence and having a choice,
Right.
Totally. It's like, with your parents.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know how I fully feel about that, which is why I'm asking these questions.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's good because we as I think about my experience, right? It's very similar. And I had that battle inside of me for a long time. Yeah. Being controlled doesn't feel good.
Right.
On a human level, right? Anytime someone's controlling you, it's not just a happy joy kind of experience.
Right.
And so I really had to work through that a lot. If God knows everything, what does that mean for me in my life? And is there a good side to that? So kind of there almost is this in me, there was almost this anger about that, but then also this weird, hold on, but if he's totally good, then maybe that's not a horrible thing, but I don't know. And so, I don't know. I live with that tension for and I still do sometimes, in a really real way.
Well, let's have some fun real quick, because then I know you have more, and hey, this is going to be a longer podcast anyways. So anyways, so there's clear things in the Bible and we can call them control or guidelines. Like, I think some of your clients would say, like, Shelby's trying to control me, and you're like, no, like, this is the way your body is designed, unfortunately. But I think there's some clear things in the Bible. It sounds like most of what you struggle with is the stuff that's not in the Bible, like life situations. So, like, you kind of say, maybe take mercy, for instance. Like, you wouldn't say God's controlling me to be merciful. You would say, like, no, that makes sense for living, like, to be gracious. You talked about being a forgiving person.
Yep.
Like, it's not like you read a Bible verse and say, God's controlling me to be a forgiving person. You would say, oh, like, this is a way to live. Like, it's most of the stuff that's not in the Bible, like life situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep.
Is that where you're at?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you keep going?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I think it begs, the question as we talk about this of, why as humans do we even care, right? Like, why do I care, so much about complete independence and control, right? If God's doing things for my benefit, potentially, and that's the ultimate question, which I wrestle with, is like, why is this so important to me? And I think for me, I like knowing that this choice was 100% mine, and I don't know why yet. I don't know why that gives me comfort and why it angers me if I have to question, like, oh, maybe this choice, wasn't 100%, mine. Maybe it was God's plan all along. And some people can accept that. And for me, I just battle with it, right? There's something that feels good about knowing that you were able to make a choice 100% yours, potentially. But was it 100% yours? I don't know.
Right. Oh, man. Such good stuff there. It really is. It really is. I just want to keep on asking you questions about that. But like even with you and Adam, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Like, okay. Did he do things for you that made you feel like, I want to marry this guy?
Yes.
Oh, this is a great story. Give everybody a little story of how you and Adam got together and got married.
Oh, do we have time on this podcast? My marriage story. So yeah, Adam and I met in college. So again, yeah, maybe God placed him in my life. Possibly, right? It was very, serendipitous, we could say. Yeah. He was placed in my life. We met. We had a bunch of friends that knew each other. And initially, I was not attracted to Adam whatsoever, was not looking for a partner. Being a control freak, I was very much like, God, I am never going to get married. This is my plan, my life course. But Adam, yes, did things that impressed me. And I, slowly started to open up and choose him and love him. And I was like, yeah, I do think I want to, marry this man. But again, maybe that was God playing with my brain, neurology, who knows. But so we got married, and we've been married for almost 7 years now, known each other for about 10 years. So, and it's a great topic because it is one of those things, like, how much did I choose Adam, or did God choose, ironically, his name being Adam for me?
No, so yeah, even that story, right? I resonate with on a couple of different levels, because my wife and I have been married for 23 years now. It's in the beginning, it was kind of this weird thing. I almost felt like I was caught up in it, but it was the same time in my life, my mid-20s, early mid-20s, that God was doing the same thing in my life, and it felt eerily the same. Like, I was drawn to God for reasons that I couldn't explain. Like, kind of like what you're talking about, even with Adam. Like, right. Like, I didn't want to hang out with Adam at first, but all of a sudden I'm around this dude, and I'm looking at him right now. He's a very handsome guy. I mean, I can understand why you would be drawn to him. But I feel like the same kind of feeling was there for me in both instances. It was almost like it wasn't a have to, it was like, no, this is amazing. I would actually want this. And it's a weird deal.
Magnetic, yeah.
Yeah.
Odd magnetic energy. Can't be
Yeah.
explained.
So I think the Bible resonates way more with you than you think. So,
How so?
I'm going to get there. So I'll throw my marriage under the bus instead of either of yours. So Robin would tell you there are seasons that we are more in sync versus not in sync. Like, and this is probably not the right there's seasons where we love each other really well, and there's seasons when we don't love each other really well. And, right now, like, we're in a beautiful season, but we have these two blessings / curses called children that you saw before that, I have a 4-year-old and an 18-month-old, and it's kind of like when it gets to 8 o'clock at night, most nights I just want to fall asleep, but I have to kind of make this choice to invest in that relationship. And what the Bible does is, I say this a lot to our listeners. If you read the book of Psalms, like if God was super controlling and insecure, like more than half of those prayers wouldn't be in the Bible. Like these are individuals that say, God, I'm upset with you. I'm mad with you. You're distant. And so as much as things like at the bottom line, God does not resolve in the Bible free will and his sovereignty. So God doesn't resolve that. And I actually think that that's helpful, but for the purposes of this podcast, it is confusing. But what we see in the Bible is a more complex view that God's okay with people being mad at him. Like he's big enough like to take it. And even as I was praying for this episode this morning, I was thinking about like, who's the most like, your husband sells real estate and like you've been in business stuff. We've had your dad, Mike Keys, on this podcast. Like if I was to ask them like in a meeting, who's the most influential person? A lot of people would actually say the most influential person is the one that has like the most power in the room. So the CEO. Mm-hmm. But if you really think about it, the most influential person in the room is usually the person that feels like they have nothing to lose. And also the person that doesn't feel like they need to control anything. Because sure, I can walk in, like, John and I can joke about this. Like, I report to a team called the Adult Ministries team. So I can go to that team and I can say, I'm the pastor. This is how we do it. Y'all, would that make me the most influential person? No. But where influence comes from, which isn't control, is it comes from to sit and listen, to maybe have a little bit of a direction, but then to kind of go from there. So I guess the first half of what I said was the Bible is kind of more empathetic to your situation than sometimes it gets credit. But the second part is I think sometimes we confuse power and influence. Sure, God has the power to do whatever he wants, but do we really want that power and control in our life, or is it influence that moves us? I don't know. John, Shelby, I don't know if I preached a message or went off track, or we're going to get notes that I'm a heretic. I don't know. Have fun with that.
No, I appreciate you sharing that. I think that totally makes sense. And I love that you dissected this important difference between power and influence, right? Because again, we sing about it. God is a mighty, powerful God. And it's very easy to confuse that with influence. And then of course, influence can trickle over into my choice, right? What is my choice? And yeah, accepting that, yes, it seems like we do. My takeaway from this question would be, we do have many choices, and God lets us make that choice, but he also, intervenes for our benefit, it sounds like, as well.
Man, yeah, this episode's going to be long. Do you want to go to your next question? We're just going to roll with this.
All right. Next question. somewhat related, a little controversial.
Okay.
But yeah, if God knows everything that's going to happen, right? And we have a choice now. We've kind of established that we have a choice. I'll say we have a choice within limits. I'll stick to that. But if God knows everything that's going to happen to us, and with everything going on, you know, in the world, and again, I go back to, you know, I have a choice. I've understood that, you know, I can now choose in today's day and age to not have kids. I can take matters. Like I said, I'm a control person. I can take matters into my own hands and choose now not to have kids. You know, whether or not that's God's plan for me, I don't know, right? My reproductive rights, I can change things. And I'm curious because I've never been taught this, or nowhere, you know, is it clear to me in the Bible, how God feels, you know, when we alter, you know, our anatomy to potentially, you know, not reproduce and fill the earth. And I even threw a verse in here because he said, you know, in Genesis, God created man, he blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And even in the Christian community, you see people, you said you have kids, you know, who have kids and then decide to have, let's say, you know, a vasectomy or have their tubes tied. So curious.
That is the first time that word's been used on this podcast.
Vasectomy?
Vasectomy.
Yeah, it's been used 5 times now, so that's great.
I love it.
No, that's awesome. No, that's a really good question, actually. Yeah.
You know, before we go into that, whatever you're comfortable with, what's your personal...
Nothing's off the table, Peter.
Obviously, you're a woman.
Yep.
So this is very... But what's kind of your background with wrestling with this question? Like, what's your story with that?
Yeah, well, I personally, and I'm very comfortable sharing, never saw myself having children. You know, my husband and I, we decided to freeze our embryos. So we have, and again, that's a whole other controversial topic, right? We have fertilized embryos that are frozen. But yeah, as I, you know, approach what would be called a geriatric, and you know, it's wild to think about this, a geriatric age for pregnancy, you know, it's something to consider. And I think also, as you know, a female and a married female, you have to think that's a lot of stress and worry to carry anytime you engage in an intimate act with your significant other. That possibility of potentially getting pregnant and having something that you don't want. And some people might say, well, you know, it's God's plan, accept it, blah, blah, blah. But again, even within the Christian community, and we might be going down a whole other road, you see women who, you know, take birth control to limit and alter potentially the plan that God has for them. So,
yeah.
Who wants to go first? I
sorry, I know it's a loaded, complicated question.
That is a very loaded, complicated question. But I think coming from, as you talk, coming from a point of genuine curiosity and genuine care, and something that I wouldn't want to trample on at all, you know. And I believe, you know, as 2 guys sitting here, it would be easy for me to just give you a pat answer and then just say, okay, now deal with it. Because I don't have to deal with it in the same way that you would have to deal with it, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, kind of the subtext in a lot of Christian cultures over the years has been that. Let me just say that.
Yeah.
You know, and admit to that in a lot of places, women have been dismissed, and they haven't been given a platform when they've brought these questions forward to say, like, is this legit? Is this not legit? They've just given pat answers and said, just deal with it.
Right.
So, but I do want to kind of address it a little bit with you, just to go, okay, here's some perspective maybe, because you asked the question. You know, I think the verse that you use is kind of a verse that people have used to say you should have as many kids as you can and fill the planet with them, right? You know, at the basis. I don't necessarily think that's everything that entails. It has an aspect of having kids to it, but that's not really the heart behind it. The overall heart is God saying to Adam and Eve, here's my mandate for you. I've given you this little garden that is everything that it's supposed to be, and I want you to expand that garden to cover the whole face of the earth, so that everything that I've created now is essentially like one big garden that's supposed to be like I've created it to be. So I want you to spread out. I want you to continue to cultivate and just fill the whole earth with this. So it's actually much deeper, much deeper than having kids. So there are people who can't have kids, right? And can still fulfill this mandate. You can
Totally.
still be you could be single, never have a romantic relationship, and still fulfill that mandate that God gives. So it's much deeper than having kids. And I think it's kind of a shallow way to view that passage when you just say, this is about having kids, have your kids now. So now that doesn't mean that kids are not a blessing too. They can be, but anybody who's had kids knows, holy cow. This is like teaching me a lot about life, but it's also sapping my soul in the process. So it's beyond just like, just do it because God says be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. There's a whole nother set of things there that are
Sure.
involved with that.
No, and that makes sense, to me, because of course, again, growing up in the church, I remember them saying,
Right.
go out and find disciples, right? He wants a relationship with as many people as possible. But I think going back to the heart of the question, it's like, how does God feel about us, verse aside, controlling our, ability to reproduce in some way, shape, or form, men and
Right.
women.
Yeah, that's legit.
I don't think we're always, the title of this, why does God want us to be curious? John and I just did like an episode that like I bore my soul and I'm like still processing. And so this guy named Matt Tebby, like I gave him a very simple scenario. Like I get really frustrated when we're about to leave the house and my wife and 2 daughters like need water. Like we don't live in the Gobi Desert. We live in Rochester. A lot of times you could actually take your cup and it will rain and fill it. So anyways, that's a whole nother. But what Matt did was he pushed 6 or 7 whys. Why is that important? Why is that important? And I think if I was talking to, and we are talking to a lot of 20s or 30 somethings, what is it really about of the hesitation to have kids or even the pressure to not have kids? Because I think what a lot of what John's saying is we don't go 6 or 7 questions why. Because some of my concern is, it's really hard to be a parent, but your life changes. And there are people that are called to not have kids. And I actually think the Bible, again, does a really good job. There's Elizabeth in the Bible who's actually barren until she has a kid when she's like in her 50s or 60s, like really late. Abraham and Rebecca. And then there's Anna, who shows up in the book of Luke and meets Jesus, never gets married, never has kids. And you can see these, like, God is actually more comfortable. I wouldn't say the ambiguity, but God is actually more comfortable with single people, with barren people, with people that struggle with infertility than most people are, because they're in the story and it's there. So I think sometimes we're not curious, because my concern with the question about having kids is not a matter of you having kids or not. And I'm thinking of our listeners. It's why are you scared to have kids? Why are you delaying to have kids? Because I go back to what John said. The verse, I actually just preached on it. It was John's fault. So he's like, here's your passage, you're preaching on this. And the Bible has this idea, the Hebrew word for peace is shalom. And shalom is not just a peace that's without conflict. It's actually a wholeness to life. And I think when we begin to weigh ourselves, I'm not actually saying this for you, but I'm going to bring up this scenario because I've had a lot of these conversations, is sometimes I'm listening to someone talk about their career and they're like, I'm going to prolong having kids. And they're like, I want to get to a place, I want to invest all in my career. I actually think the biggest curse in your life is not missing out on your dream. It's actually getting your dream and realizing it's not as great as you thought.
Sure.
So, believe it or not, I dreamed of playing basketball for the NBA. And I've kind of played that scenario out in my head. Like, what would have happened if I wasn't 5'7", if I was faster, if I could dunk, if I was 6'6"? And maybe it would have been awesome. But I've talked to enough athletes that, by the time you're 35, I'm 36 years old. I don't move like I used to. I'm probably more fit. Like, I go to the gym. I eat relatively healthy. I'm afraid to tell you what I eat. But anyways, that's a whole nother topic. But, I look at that and I'm like, if I really got what I wanted, would I really be that happy? And I think that that's kind of the question with kids, is looking at our life. How did God create us? What do we really want? And it's challenging. Like, I'm struggling how to talk about this, because I think that people have good reasons to wait to have kids, but I also feel like people aren't necessarily digging deeper to what is my resistance to this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I'll push back a little bit, of course, because my question is, it's purely just a curious one of, and I just want to know, how does God feel about maybe the Christian men, and it could be the Christian men here at Browncroft, having a vasectomy, maybe after they've had kids. I have many relatives, Christian relatives, who are like, I don't want this. I've had 3 kids, and even pastors. And what I'm hearing from you is like, well, if God's calling, because I remember the stories of Abraham, blah, blah, blah. If God's calling is for you not to have kids, then guess what? Just go have all the unprotected sex in the world and you won't have kids if that's God's calling. But at the time the Bible was written, these services, surgeries were not available. And now the reality is people are taking advantage of that. Right. So it's like, I just want to know how God feels about that. Right?
This is a good question. This is a very good question, and a very, let's just admit this isn't talked about very much. Okay?
No, it's not. So I appreciate you guys
talking about it. This is a very good question. And I'm going to be very vulnerable, because this is a vulnerable space. Pete knows that this is my style, okay? Yep. So I have gone through this exact scenario that you're talking about here. So I had 2 kids. My wife and I said we want to have at least 2 kids, maybe 4. We ended up having 2 kids. We're like, they have the personalities of 8, so we're going to, we need to know. And so I actually sought, some advice from people who were down the road from me that I respected, who I said, these people seem to be kind of like godly dudes, and yet they are, real about life. And I just posed the question to them, like, what do I do? Right. What do I do? And, had some really great conversations. For all the viewers at home, I've had a vasectomy. Okay, so there we go. I admitted it.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Tweet that. Yeah. I had a vasectomy, yes, John Amayo.
Yeah. That might be the most, profound thing I've ever said on this podcast. So,
you're welcome.
But yeah. But that's where I came. I came to the conclusion through a lot of talking with people that I trusted, through my own reading. I was like, I don't think this is morally wrong for me to do, and my wife and I have to make a decision about this for our marriage, in the context of our marriage, and for us, that was available to us. Mm-hmm. It's not available to everybody, but we said, this is what we feel like is the right choice for us, and we made that choice.
So just to jump it, I went to the other side. I'll come to the vasectomy side, so to speak. I haven't had a vasectomy yet, so I'll just. Okay. I figured if you're real, you might as well. Good. So, number one, the Bible is written for us, not to us. So I think sometimes we get confused with that. So, the Bible was written in a specific time and specific place. AD 33. Around when Jesus was alive. So there's certain things that happen that the Bible doesn't speak directly to. So there's certain things now in our culture that, the Bible's very much, so like for instance, the Bible's against gossip. All right. So it doesn't take long to go to social media, and if someone subtweets someone, like, that's gossip. That's wrong. It's not necessarily me going behind their back, but there's a very clear line. There's other things like vasectomies that I would place in Romans 14. Now, I'm going to get a little nerdy with you again, but one of the hugest issues in the early church was eating meat offered to idols. So if you can read Acts. So at first, like, the apostles said, don't eat meat offered to idols. Like, and their whole point was they're not associated, they're not good. Then you go forward and it's like, well, you can eat meat offered to idols, but if it offends someone, like, just eat the meat in private. And then it kind of like all of a sudden transformed. Hey, it's okay to eat meat offered to idols. I use that example because I think sometimes we miss, and this isn't every issue, but I would put vasectomies in this issue. I'd even put eggs in this issue, where there's a matter of conscience, and it goes back to what I originally said on the first end. Why are you getting a vasectomy? Why are you doing this? Where I think God gives us some freedoms, but ultimately there's people that have conscience with this. So, on the other hand, there's people that, they have 10 to 12 kids. God bless them. I'm not going to do that.
As far as you know.
As far as I know.
You could.
Robin. Anyways, but I also know people, and this is kind of the control factor, that have had vasectomies and then they have had children. Like, it's not out of the question. And so I think sometimes we get so focused on these issues that, like, we see in the Bible kind of some pathways. There's certain things that don't change, but there's also certain things that, like, if I was to talk to someone about meat offered to idols, it's like a huge deal. And I actually think vasectomies, there are people that, for conscience sake, they don't do that. We can get really deep here. They might not be comfortable with vasectomies, but they're happy to put on condoms. That's a whole nother topic, but we're just getting real here. So
it's like, how do you know what is morally right or acceptable, right? Like, you and your wife decided that this did feel morally right. How did you know, right? The way that God calls really to us is very different, or seems very different today than it did in the Bible, right? Like, people, according to the Bible, and again, this is what they wrote, was they would literally hear like voices or callings. And, some people say, I have this really strong emotion. This is what, I was made to do. It's like, how do you know, this is the right,
That's a really good question. That's a really good one. Oh, yeah. So how do you know on some of these issues that aren't
clear cut?
How do you know? I think that's so good. So I would say I can tell you how I walk through the process. This isn't just about this issue. This is about every issue that's kind of related to this. Is, first of all, I look, kind of have an understanding of the Bible. I go, is there anything in there that would tell me this is not a good idea? Like, absolutely not. Don't do it. Like, and then I got to be straight up and go, like, okay, well, like, if it says, this is definitely wrong, then I got to be honest and go, okay, well, then I know my answer there. But a lot of the stuff isn't a definitely wrong kind of thing. So then my kind of phase 2 is I go to people who I respect, who I trust, who I think are listening to God in their lives, and I go, here's my problem. I want you to give me your honest answer. You know me, you know my heart. Here's what I'm going through. And then I let them talk to me, and I stay open. Because I think one of the temptations that I have is to be like, I know the answer. I want you to give me, just give me my answer.
Right.
And then I stay open and I listen. And I think there's such value. In our society, we're so individualistic that we separate like our spiritual life, we compartmentalize it as just us and God. That's it. And I think that's, to our own harm when we do that, because there's other people in our life for a reason. So that's been super valuable to me. And then I think just taking the time to really go to God with it and say, God, here's where I'm at. Like, I don't know the way you want to direct me in this, but this is really what I'm feeling about this. If you want to shape this in another way, can you tell me? Some way. The beautiful part about God is he isn't trying to trick you. Like, and I have to tell this to people all the time, because I really, really honestly believe this. This has showed up in my life so many times. Like, he isn't trying to go like, Shelby, I want to like put you through this horrible test that if you ask me what you want me to do, I'm just going to trick you until, he's like, no, of course. Right. You're a daughter. Of course I want to tell you what I want you to do, of course. And so to kind of remain open to him telling me what he wants me to do too. So I would say all of that together kind of helps me form a way forward for me. Does that get the...
No, it does. And I guess going off of that question for both of you is, have either of you had an experience, and I'm sure you have, where the calling from God was so clear and great that you felt it? And if so, what did that feel like? Just curious about your experience with God, when you were like, you called upon him in a situation that you're like, I remember this time, this is, the most prominent or maybe most recent, and this is what it felt like, because it can be, I think, confusing, especially as a new follower, again, grown up in the church, but trying to, get that relationship back. So I would consider myself a new follower. Yeah. It's confusing as to like, does God want me to do this? And maybe it's my own, self-doubt. It's funny, I want a choice, but of course we constantly question that choice. But I wonder if there's ever been a choice you've made that it was very evident that like, this is what God wants for me, and I know it, and this is how I know it.
Sure. I just kind of jumped in.
Yeah.
So, when I met Robin, I'm looking at your mom that's here. Like, your mom was like the first one to know. Like, your mom is like so intuitive. She's like, Robin, you're dating someone, and she just knew. So Robin and I were dating long distance, and, we've had my wife on. She's super gracious, but there was a moment that she said, someone's moving and it's not me. And I was living in Philadelphia. And people ask me, like, was it hard to get married? Was it hard to get engaged? But there was a point after much prayer, it's like, I'm moving to Rochester and I'm marrying Robin. And it was a lot of work. So the institution I worked for, Valley Forge, during the summer, a lot of colleges do this, like, they had half-day Fridays. So there was a span of like 4 or 5 months that I was driving pretty much every other weekend to find a job here. And it didn't seem like God was opening any doors. And like, I was like on LinkedIn, and I was trying to find a job. I was meeting with anybody. And like, I think, and this isn't always how God works, but I was so career focused that for me to move to Rochester and be like, yeah, I'll work an office job, was so like people would be like, what? Like, what do you, like, sure, I'll marry Robin, and if this is what you want me to do, like, I'll work, just outside of church. And so I found a job here. I realized that higher education wasn't for me. I sold cell phones for a little bit. And I knew, and still to this day, like, I feel so committed to Rochester. Like, I feel so committed to this church. Like, and I go back, and I felt like God has spoken to that. Now, I always caveat that with, I don't know what God has for the future. But, like, I was pretty sure that God had me go to Rochester. There was 24 hours when I was dating Robin that I wouldn't say we broke up, but, like, I was interviewing for a job at Valley Forge, didn't get the job. But, like, one night we were FaceTiming. Like, we know each other. Like, we know our anniversary based on the fact that we got our first smartphones when we started dating. We were FaceTiming. And I'll remember the first time I talked with her, she's like, I could move to Philadelphia. And literally the next night, she's like, I can't do it. And I had to deal with some of the emotions in me. Like, you're asking me to move all the way to Rochester and you're not willing to move for me. But I dealt with those. and I lived committed to it because I believed this is the right thing. Did I fully know if it's the right thing? Does sometimes Browncroft question if it's the right thing? Does John question? I don't know, but like I just felt it's the, and even in this season, like, you know, I look at some of the experiences that I had. I grew up with a pastor who stayed for 22 years, and I'm even looking at now, I'm going on year 8, that there's conversations and things that I can have that I couldn't have somewhere else. So I guess when I look at God speaking, that whole season of trying to find a job was super difficult. Like, I didn't know how I was going to do that. And, you know, there's some crazy people named Mike and Tammy Keys that, like, you can live with us for a year. And I don't know how they feel about that. But anyway, no, love your parents. So anyways, that's my story. What about yours?
Man, I mean, there's a bunch. Some of the big moments in life. But as I'm just sitting here thinking about it, I'm just like, where is it? And I kind of feel like the moments of desperation are where God meets me. And when I have to have him show up, if that makes any sense. Like, I remember when my son was, I think, in 6th or 7th grade, and my wife called me and said, the school just called. He's having a panic attack. And I didn't know what to do. She's like, I have this other thing I have to be at. I can you go pick him up? And I was like, sure. So I left what I was doing. I went to the school, and the whole drive, I'm like, God, what do I do? What do I do? Like, I'm out of my league here. I don't know what in the world to do. And so I pull into the parking lot. I get into the parking space. I'm still like struggling. Like, what do I do? And I just have this sense of give him a hug. Give him a hug. And I don't know where that came from. I trust is because God was just telling me in the moment. He knew what I needed. And it wasn't an audible voice or anything, but that's just what I felt. And I walked into the school, and I see him sitting at a table in the nurse's office, and he's kind of got his lunch out, and I'm almost getting like emotional just talking about it, but you know, feeling kind of ashamed and alone. And I just walked up to him, and I just gave him a hug, and it was like he just melted in my arms when I gave him a hug. And it was like he was experiencing the shame or this burden that he was carrying around, and all he really needed was his dad to give him a hug. And so when I think about the moments in my life that, you know, there's been big moments, but that doesn't show up on a flashy thing or something like that. But it was a moment of desperation that I needed God to tell me what to do, and I really felt like he showed up and told me what to do in that moment. So,
yeah. No,
yeah.
Thank you both for sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you? Have you ever felt that?
Yeah.
You know, it's definitely a tough question to answer, because I think for the longest time, to be honest, I wasn't paying attention or looking for it. You know, the only instance for me where I can say, you know, vividly, I actively recall, you know, feeling this way, and I was like, this has to be God, was probably on my wedding day. I had bronchitis. I was sick. I had lost all this weight. 2 weeks before, I had to order a new wedding dress because they had botched my wedding dress. It didn't fit. Like, everything was falling apart, but I'll never forget. And things went wrong on the day. Like, we ran out of alcohol. Like, who runs out of alcohol at a wedding? Apparently, yeah, you know, Jesus
Jesus stepped in that one. So,
Michael Keys stepped in and found a way to provide more booze. I mean, you know, maybe it's the guests we invited, but that's a different story. So Jesus likes wine. You know, that's always a plus. Yeah. But anyways, I just remember having this like exceptional sense of calm and peace that I couldn't describe. Like I said, things went wrong, and it was just like, okay. I was like, I'm never this go with the flow and chill. And it was just, this wild sense of like nothing can shake me or rock me. we ended up, there were issues with the buses. We ended up taking my mom's Lexus back, but it was like, okay, everything was just like, you just felt like you were just floating, and it wasn't the alcohol. So, but yeah, that's the, the only instance I can think of and recall where I was like, this has to be,
Wow.
A godly presence here, blessing this day and present on this day.
Wow.
But I'll definitely be looking for it, because I think you both touch upon, really important points, that it doesn't have to be this big, shiny light shown down from heaven. It's so evident. It sounds like, sometimes there are these moments of doubt that are present, and that's okay. And it can be in these simple moments as well. It doesn't have to be, certainly it can be in moments of desperation, but it doesn't have to be, I hit rock bottom and God, show me your light. And sometimes there are these underlying emotions of I don't know if this is the right decision, but I'm feeling like it is. I'm feeling like you're telling me like it is. And that's okay too. But just to kind of be present and call upon God, and pay attention and be aware.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. I think you're just bringing up something that's super key in this whole thing, and maybe a great way to, wrap up or whatever. But as I think about a lot of the misconceptions that are there with the Christian faith, sometimes people talk about faith and doubt as total opposites. Like, you can't have any doubts if you have faith. And that's just the furthest thing from the truth in reality. Like, our faith, goes hand in hand with doubts. Like, these things are a tension that we live in all the time. I think if you talk with anybody who's walked with Jesus for a long time, they would admit, hey, I've had a lot of seasons of doubt in my life where I didn't know how this was going to work out, how God was going to show up. And sometimes God uses those doubts to actually produce the deepest faith in us, which is anti, what we're taught a lot of times, but a lot of times I've seen it show up as true in my life. So, yeah.
Well, we're going to close the same way we always do. So the neat thing is, John and I are going to answer this question, but you get to kind of close. You get the final word.
Ooh, lucky me.
I mean,
I'm excited.
Yeah. So what does Jesus have to say about this topic? Why does God want us to be curious? You or me? You tell me. Are you?
Well, yeah, no, yeah, go for it.
Go for it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
You've probably put a lot of thought into this. I'm just sitting here soaking up the moment.
I podcast like my Italian mother makes sauce.
Yeah.
Like, you just got to feel it out.
Right.
It's
I get that.
A little garlic here, a little basil there. So, no, Shelby, you've challenged me, because I think what Jesus does in the Bible is he's not afraid of questions. So, like, even the church, we were having a pre-conversation, the church that you're going to in Portland, one of the reasons you're drawn to that church is they're not afraid of the questions. And one of the reasons we have this podcast is we're not afraid of the questions. And, I'm probably going to be leaving this conversation. Did I answer that right? But a lot of times I think what Jesus is doing is he's challenging us to be way more curious and to ask the deeper questions. Because a lot of the times these surface issues, they're surface issues. There's a whole nother stuff underneath. And I think Jesus wants us to be curious. There's a scene in the Bible that kind of makes me think of you, in a good way. So there's this woman that she's a Gentile, and she has this daughter that's sick. And Jesus, basically, she's like, can you heal my daughter? And he's like, he basically calls, says, why would I do anything for dogs? That's kind of his terminology. And the woman looks back at him and she's like, even the crumbs the dog eats. It's such a Shelby moment, because I could just see you being like, oh, we're going to play this game. And Jesus is like, I've never seen that much faith. And I just think that there's a raw authenticness that we don't always talk about, that it's not clean and it's not neat. And probably some of our listeners are going to be like, you didn't really answer some of the questions, because that's kind of the way faith is. It's this tension of faith and doubt and wondering where God is. So I don't know. That's what I'm leaving with. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just appreciate you being here, Shelby, and bringing the genuineness of your soul, not just the genuineness of your questions. Why does God want us curious? I just think of Jesus' invitation to the kids when I hear this, when I think about this question. And he says the kingdom of heaven, like the disciples are trying to get the kids away from Jesus. And he says, no, don't put the kids away, because the kingdom of heaven is like these little kids. And I think what he's talking about there is the nature that kids bring with them of faith combined with a genuine curiosity. Like there's both. Like, well, why? And if you talk with kids for any length of time, it's always why this and why that. And Jesus isn't afraid of that. Jesus is not afraid at all of that. And yet those questions sometimes lead to a deeper trust and a deeper faith. And that's what I want to be true of my life, is just that I continue to ask those questions and continue to be curious with the people around me and with God too. And hopefully that will grow my faith over time too. So yeah, thanks for even inspiring me as I sit here today. It's great to engage in this stuff with you.
Yeah. No, likewise. Thank you.
You get the final word.
Yeah. What do you think?
Oh, no, final word. This has been just great. It's so nice that you guys offer this space to ask questions, because I think you touched upon a really good point, John, that it deepens that trust, right? You know, I am obviously trusting God to speak through both of you, and coming from a place where, again, there has been some of that church hurt. It's nice to have a space where our listeners, you know, can listen to these questions and have you guys be totally transparent and very vulnerable and open and honest. And, you know, speaking to honesty, one thing I know we were talking about in the beginning is that sometimes we won't have all of the answers, right? The Bible might not have all of the answers given how we've evolved, and that's okay, right? That's where faith comes into play, and trust, for sure, you know, and the Bible does a great job giving us this guidance at the end of the day, which you guys have both given to me, which I appreciate. And I think you both did an incredible job answering the questions, you know, as best as you could, given God's word and what he's given to you. So thank you.
Well, hey, you can find us at whygotawhypodcast.com. Click the subscribe button. Shelby, do you want anybody to follow you online, or we usually?
They can if they want, but they certainly don't have to. I have an Instagram handle. It's just Fit and Balanced RD, but that's it. Yeah.
All right.
Ah, nice. They should go to you for dietitian advice. I'm going to go to you for dietitian advice right after this.
Well,
so,
thank
anyway,
you.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, thanks for joining us today. We hope you have a great day.